Thank you. I'd like to join the speakers before me, thanking the very generous hosts and organizers for this beautiful conference. And before I go into telling you what cancer prevention Europe is, I want to start with some figures on primary prevention. And primary prevention is really still underappreciated in cancer research and also cancer research funding, which is a little bit curious because I think many people would prefer not to get cancer in the first place. So you've seen some figures. This is complementing, and of course the figures are different to the ones you have seen before. And this is because here we have a definition of Europe, which is the United Nations definition of 40 countries. And the agency has estimated that in 2018 we had 4.2 million new cases of cancer in that particular year. And the prediction models that were already introduced by Dr. Weiderpass yesterday say that until 2040, this is increasing to 5.2 million per year, which means over the total time span, we are expecting about 100 million new cancer cases in Europe in this 20 to 25 years. And I actually plotted because we made a very detailed calculation in 2018. If you look at the last registered number of cases from 2020, this is 4.4 million. And this actually confirms what Laurent was asking yesterday, that apparently our prediction models sadly work well, because this is identical to what was predicted in 2018, which means this 100 million is not a worst case scenario. It's unfortunately the number of patients we have to expect. And we've been reminded yesterday that this is not a count, but each of these numbers is a personal fate. It's a person, it's an affected family that are suffering. So then it appears even more unacceptable that out of this 100 million, we could theoretically prevent 40 million because we know what causes these cancers. And in principle, for many, we also have good ideas of how they could be prevented. It's the implementation that is really suffering. So we think that about 40% could be prevented. There's a small fraction of cancers where we know the causes, but we cannot prevent them. I mean, this is mainly natural exposures or genetic causes. But what is really striking is that half of all the preventable cancers are still in Europe caused by tobacco. So this is a carcinogen that we know for 5 to 6 decades. So it seems very weird how, as a society, we can still accept that almost 1 million cancers are caused by this industry 50, 60 years later. And you see this is followed by this whole block of unhealthy diet, lack of physical activity, and heavy body weight, causing about 15% of the cancers. Alcohol consumption, we heard also already yesterday, is a bit underestimated. Also in Europe, even the awareness in the population is still very low here. And then comes the infections, radiations, and occupational causes of cancer. And the environment, which in Europe is mainly the air pollution, with about 1% of cancers. And this is a fraction we also discussed yesterday that would be higher because of the indoor air pollution in many low and middle income countries. So again, this is complementing what we heard already, and this is the two different ways you can look at the cancer data when we are talking about the incidence. And you've seen in many slides already this left type of figure, which is the incidence that is adjusted for the underlying age in the population. And this is what we use when we want to see whether preventive measures are successful, because this describes the risk in the population. And then you can see that we have some success when we look here at the lung cancer rates, that in men, the rates were peaking in the 1980s. It's going down. It's an open question why this is not happening in the women, because I mean the preventive measures are exactly the same. So it's the labeling of the packages, it's the extra taxes, but you can see that the lung cancer risk in women have been continuously increasing. However, if you look at the absolute number of cases of lung cancer, then you have to draw your attention to the right-hand side. And this is because here the population size of the at-risk population comes into play. And because Europe is getting older, life expectancy is getting higher, the at-risk population is increasing. And this shows that actually this decrease in risk in men is not translating in fewer patients, it's actually the opposite. You see that the number of cases of lung cancer also in men is continuing to increase now after a small dip in the 1990s. In women, it has increased 12-fold over the last 50, 60 years. So actually the sad record number of tobacco-related cancers in Europe happened in 2022. And well, I'm not revealing a secret that this will not be a long record, and we have another sad record to look forward to in 2023. So very quickly, how do we kind of establish these causes of cancer? It's a three-step process. It's the 3 lines of evidence that we take from cell experiments, from animal experiments, and to some extent from the epidemiological studies. The first step is to see which are the carcinogenic substances. So this is the hazard identification. And I think the largest program in the world on hazard identification of cancer is the monograph program by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And then the epidemiological studies, you are estimating the individual risk. So what is really, if you are exposed to a substance and you look at the dose of the substance, how does this change your individual risk of developing cancer? And then in the last step, you want to see how many people are affected in the population. And this, of course, is informing your cancer control plans to prevention. And very quickly, one example, we know from the hazard identification that artificial ultraviolet radiation, like from sunbed use, is carcinogenic to humans. From the combination of all epidemiological studies, we estimate that with each session of sunbed use per year, your risk of skin melanoma increases by 2%, meaning that if you go to a sunbed every week, your risk could increase by 100%, or you would have a doubling in risk of skin melanoma. And if we apply this individual risk to survey data from France of how many people use sunbeds and how often, then we can estimate that almost 400 cases of skin melanoma could be prevented in France if, for instance, sunbeds would be banned. So the components of cancer prevention are really the etiological research first, and I really welcome the comments from yesterday from President von Braun and Cardinal Turkson that etiological research also means this is also a global question. I'm presenting cancer prevention Europe here, but it's an opportunity to really highlight that unfortunately this etiological research is also very much underrepresented in low-middle income countries. And even if we do this kind of research in low-middle income countries, it's very often factors that we also experience in the high-income countries by saying, well, because the results have to be informative for our countries. But there's very few research support that says we are looking really at specifically the cultural habits and the exposure conditions in low-income countries, because even the occupational hazards will be very different because the exposure profiles are so different. Intervention research is the next step, so how to find the most cost-effective interventions. And then, of course, the implementation research, because it's not one size fits all. We have the hard-to-reach populations. Of course, you probably need programs that target children in a different way than adults. And again, we have the cultural context that is very important to be implemented here. So it's a big task. It's very long-term studies. And this means it needs the sustainable funding and infrastructures also to tackle all these challenges. So this is when in the Eurocan platform, the idea first came up that not only the cancer centers for treatment, but also the cancer centers doing prevention research should create their own platform for collaboration in Europe. And we were a little bit, of course, not reinventing the wheel, but saying, well, let's take the same concept that has been now defined for the Cancer Core Europe by saying we are open to a lot of partners in Europe, but we have a relatively small steering group because that helps us of being operational and moving forward perhaps a bit more rapidly. And on this screen, you see the steering group partners of Cancer Prevention Europe. And a lot of them are represented also here in the audience. You see the DKZ Karolinska Institute, the Danish Cancer Society, the European Institute of Oncology in Italy, IAC is chairing, and the Secretariat of Cancer Prevention Europe. We have INCA from France. We have the World Cancer Research Fund, Maastricht University, and partners from the UK, Imperial College London, Cancer Research UK, and the UK Therapeutic Cancer Prevention Network. And the consortium consists since 2017. So it's a kind of a shared vision that is really the manifesto of this platform, that we really need research into optimizing the implementation of the known preventive interventions. So this is the implementation research that I defined before, which is to return really on the investment in research on etiology and interventions, better dissemination and research translation to inform policies and practice. So it's an advocacy task, but also not forget that we really need more innovation in identifying risk factors. So what is the other 50%? That's a good question. And I think still a lot of Nobel Prizes to win for people who get some breakthroughs here. And of course, the specific task of Cancer Prevention Europe is to have this in a coordinated manner so that it really gives added value among European countries with a long-term vision, with a sustainable infrastructure, sharing capacity, specifically in training and quality improvement. And the agency alone has a really very successful training program for postdoctoral researchers to kind of build up the international network. Evaluation of prevention, and as I said, the advocacy are additional tasks. So one of the prevention tools guiding really prevention in Europe is the European Code Against Cancer that I'm sure all of you know by heart, so I don't have to go into details. It started as an initiative actually by the European Commission already in the 1980s. It's a long-term project. The agency has taken over with the update of the 4th edition, and we have just started the update to the 5th edition of the code with a scoping meeting last week in Lyon. And this is really to make sure to give the advice. This is what the scientific evidence tells. So this is not about precaution. This is really that you follow these recommendations to reduce your cancer risk. There's a guarantee that it lowers your risk of developing or dying from cancer. And this is important, I think, specifically in the times today of social media, where you hear about a new cause of cancer almost on a daily basis. And this is really also making sure not to forget about tobacco, alcohol, and all these risk factors we know for a long time, but unfortunately the prevention has not been successful. And inspired by this European code, the agency has set up the World Code Against Cancer Framework Program last year, and we are relatively advanced with the first Latin American and Caribbean Code Against Cancer. We started activities in Asia, and very high on our wish list is actually finding partners in Africa for a first African Code Against Cancer. So just some examples what this prevention research really entails. I gave the example already that age is a factor of what you have to consider when you do prevention. So for children, adolescents, of course, it's much more important to focus on never start smoking, while for the adult smokers, of course, you have to inform them about successful smoking cessation programs. The awareness of alcohol drinking, this is really hard to reach populations. And you see from an EU survey that almost 10% of the EU population drink daily, 30% weekly. So it's a long way to go. And we are all aware of the epidemic of overweight and obesity. And you see that 60% of adults in Europe have now an unhealthy body weight. And also 1 in 3 children are overweight and obese. So this is another cancer epidemic to come. And theoretically, we know how to prevent it. So I'm coming to my take-home messages. So again, this is really a daunting figure, 100 million new cancer cases in Europe in the next 20 to 25 years, knowing that 40% of these cancers would be preventable. We need the cancer prevention research has to complement the research on treatment. Etiological research is important. 50% of causes still to be identified, even more necessary in also parts of the world outside of Europe. Intervention study and implementation research for how do you really implement all this knowledge in the different populations. And the infrastructures we have in place is really networks like Cancer Prevention Europe, but then also international organizations like IAC, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, WHO Euro, or the Association of European Cancer Leagues, to mention the ones relevant in Europe. And by this, I'd like to thank you for your attention.